The millionaire came home early only once, and that single mistake saved his 4-year-old daughter from a nightmare hidden in the most beautiful room of his mansion. Dorian Hale had built his life with numbers, contracts, and decisions that could change entire companies before lunch. In Seattle, people knew him as a man who never missed a meeting, never lost control, and never allowed emotion to interfere with business. But inside his own home, behind polished doors, expensive curtains, and the soft smell of lavender candles, the one thing he loved most was slowly disappearing in front of him. His daughter, Eloan, was only 4 years old. She should have been noisy. She should have been running through hallways, leaving toys on the stairs, asking impossible questions, laughing at cartoons, spilling juice, refusing bedtime, and turning every morning into chaos. Instead, the mansion had become strangely quiet around her. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that did not belong to a child's home. Every morning, Dorian saw the same scene. Eloan sat at the long breakfast table in her pale pajamas, tiny feet hanging above the floor, fingers twisted together on her lap. Her face looked thinner each week, her eyes too large for her small face, her skin almost colorless under the chandelier light. When he asked if she was ready for preschool, she lowered her head. She was tired. Her stomach hurt. She did not want to go. And every time, Maris Vance, Dorian's elegant second wife, stepped in with the same calm explanation. Eloan was sensitive. Eloan's digestion was weak. Eloan needed rest, clean food, breathing routines, and strict care. School was too risky. Other children carried gams. Cafeteria snacks were dangerous. Ordinary food upset her body. Ordinary habits made her worse. Dorian wanted to believe it because believing it was easier than facing the truth. Maris always looked so composed. Her hair was perfect. Her clothes were spotless. Her voice was soft enough to calm a room. She spoke of health, discipline, immune balance, nutrition, and childhood development with such confidence that Dorian rarely questioned her. He had lost Eloan's mother years earlier, and the fear of losing his daughter made him easy to convince. So he worked longer. He trusted Maris more. He told himself that the strange silence in the house was healing. He told himself that his daughter's tired eyes were part of recovery. He told himself that love sometimes meant allowing someone stronger to take control. That morning, rain pressed against the mansion windows, turning the sky over Seattle a heavy gray. Dorian was dressed for a flight to Denver, where a meeting waited with investors who expected him to arrive sharp, prepared, and untouchable. He came down the curved staircase with his briefcase in hand and found Eloan sitting at the breakfast table again, smaller than ever in the huge room. In front of her was a glass of thick green juice. She stared at it like it was punishment. Her hands trembled when she lifted the glass. Her throat moved hard as she forced it down. Her shoulders tightened, but she did not complain. She simply swallowed, set the empty glass down, and looked at her lap as if even breathing too loudly might be wrong. Dorian noticed the tremor. He noticed the cold sweat near her temples. He noticed how she seemed afraid to move. But Maris smiled and called it cleansing. Dorian almost accepted that answer. Then Eloan slipped off her chair and walked to him barefoot across the cold floor. She held out a folded drawing with both hands. It was made with crayons, but there was almost no color in it. A crooked house stood under a dark sky. Every window was colored black. Outside the house sat a tiny stick figure with no mouth. Dorian looked at that mouthless child for a long moment. Something inside him shifted. He touched Eloan's forehead and felt ice-cold skin under his palm. The child was sweating, but her body felt chilled, as though the warmth had been drained out of her. He looked at Maris, waiting for alarm, but she only gave him another calm explanation. Another routine. Another reason not to worry. Dorian left the house with the drawing still in his briefcase. He should have gone to the airport. He should have boarded the plane. He should have spent the day in a conference room while his daughter remained trapped in the silence he had mistaken for care. But fate intervened. A storm warning shut down flights before his car reached the terminal. The meeting was cancelled. The city roads darkened under heavy rain, and for the first time in months, Dorian had no excuse to stay away from home. He ordered the driver to turn around. On the way back, he stopped at a toy store and bought Aloan a porcelain doll in a pink dress, thinking it might bring back even a small smile. He imagined her hugging it. He imagined her looking like a child again. He imagined returning as a loving father instead of the absent man he had become. But as the car rolled through the iron gates of the mansion, the house looked wrong. No lights glowed warmly in the front windows. No music played. No television murmured from the family room. The mansion stood still under the storm, beautiful from outside, but sealed like a secret. Dorian told the driver not to announce him. He entered alone. The front door opened without a sound. Cold air swept in behind him, then disappeared as the door shut. Inside, the silence felt thick, almost alive. His wet shoes touched the marble floor. He placed the gift box on a table and listened. Nothing. No laughter. No footsteps. No voice from Maris. No soft movement from the housekeeper. Then he heard it. Tick, tick, tick. A slow, sharp, mechanical sound coming from upstairs. Dorian climbed the staircase carefully. The carpet swallowed his steps. The ticking grew louder with every step, steady and merciless, like a countdown inside the walls. At the end of the hallway, near the family room Maris called Aloan's comm space, a thin line of light cut across the floor from a half-closed door. He stopped. Through the ticking came the sound of a child breathing hard. Not playing. Not laughing. Not resting. Struggling. Dorian moved closer, and the world he thought he understood began to crack. His daughter was behind that door. His wife was there too. And whatever was happening inside was not medicine, not healing, not protection. It was the reason Aloan no longer wanted school. It was the reason she had drawn a child with no mouth. It was the reason the mansion had become so quiet. Dorian leaned toward the narrow opening, and what he saw on the other side froze him in place. What Dorian saw through that narrow opening did not look like care, training, or discipline. It looked like something colder, something calculated, something that had been happening long enough to reshape a child's body and mind without leaving obvious scars. The room was designed to feel safe. Soft pastel walls, painted clouds, neatly arranged toys, a warm rug, shelves filled with books meant for children. Everything suggested comfort, innocence, protection. But in the center of that carefully crafted space stood a scene that did not belong in any childhood. Aloan stood on a small, unstable wooden stool. Not standing naturally, not playing, not pretending. She balanced on one foot, the other lifted and stretched in front of her, toes pointed unnaturally as if her tiny muscles had been trained to hold tension beyond their limits. Her arms were raised straight above her head, holding a thick hardcover dictionary far too heavy for her size. Her body trembled continuously. It was not a momentary shake. It was a deep, uncontrollable vibration, the kind that came from exhaustion pushed too far. Sweat ran down from her hairline, sliding across her pale cheeks, dripping from her chin onto the wooden floor below. Her thin nightdress clung to her small frame, outlining ribs that should not have been visible on a child her age. In front of her, on the wall, a small black mark had been drawn at eye level. Her gaze was locked onto it, unblinking, as if she had been ordered never to look away. The ticking sound came from a metronome placed on a low table in the corner. Its steady rhythm cut through the silence, marking time with mechanical precision. Each tick felt like a command. Each second stretched into something heavier than it should have been. Maris sat a few feet away on a velvet chair. Her posture was relaxed, elegant, composed in a way that felt completely disconnected from the scene in front of her. One leg crossed over the other, a delicate teacup in her hand, her expression calm and observant. In her other hand, she held a stopwatch. She was not angry. She was not shouting. That made it worse. She watched. She evaluated. Every movement Eloan made was measured. Every tremor registered. Every slight loss of balance noted. When the child's supporting knee bent even a fraction, Maris did not react emotionally. She simply adjusted something on the stopwatch, as if recalculating a process. This was not a moment of frustration or loss of control. This was routine. Dorian understood it instantly, and the realization hit him harder than anything he had experienced in years. This had been happening every day. Every hour he spent away from home, every meeting he attended, every flight he took, had left his daughter alone in this room, under this system. The green juice, the silence, the fatigue, the refusal to go to school, the cold skin, the trembling hands. None of it was illness. It was the result of this. Eloan's breathing became uneven. Her small chest rose and fell rapidly, each inhale shallow, each exhale strained. Her arms wavered under the weight of the book, dipping slightly before she forced them back up with visible effort. The muscles in her legs shook so violently that the stool itself began to shift under her. She did not cry. That was what made it unbearable. A child in pain usually cries. A child in fear reaches out. But Eloan remained silent, her lips pressed together tightly, as if she had learned that making noise would only make things worse. Her body was not just tired. It was conditioned. Dorian's eyes moved to the floor and noticed faint marks scratched into the wood beneath the stool. Small, repeated indentations, as if something had been dragged, repositioned, adjusted countless times. This was not the first session. It was not even the 10th. This room had become a training ground. The metronome continued its relentless ticking. The stopwatch in Maris's hand clicked softly as she pressed it again, resetting something unseen but clearly important to her system. Her attention never wavered. She did not look concerned. She did not hesitate. Everything about her suggested control, certainty, and belief in what she was doing. Dorian felt something inside him collapse. For months, he had believed that his daughter was fragile. That she needed protection. That the strict routines were necessary. That the discomfort was temporary, part of a healing process. But nothing in this room resembled healing. This was construction. Not of health, but of obedience. Not of strength, but of submission. Eloan's entire body jerked suddenly as her balance nearly gave out. The book tilted dangerously to one side, her arms shaking so violently that it seemed impossible she could hold it any longer. Her raised foot dropped slightly, her posture breaking for a fraction of a second. Dorian instinctively stepped forward, but stopped himself before pushing the door open. Something held him there, frozen between action and realization. He needed to understand. He needed to see the full truth before he destroyed whatever illusion still existed between him and the woman he had trusted. Eloan corrected herself, forcing her leg back into position, lifting the book higher, straightening her spine with visible effort. The correction was immediate, automatic, practiced. It was the response of someone who had failed before and learned the consequences. Dorian's breathing slowed, not out of calm, but out of shock. This was not a single moment of cruelty. This was a system. A system that had been carefully designed, repeated, reinforced, and hidden behind words like discipline, health, and perfection. And the worst part was not the physical strain. It was the silence. No crying. No resistance. No request for help. Only obedience. Only endurance. Only a 4-year-old child standing alone in the center of a room that looked like safety, slowly breaking under the weight of expectations she could not possibly understand. The ticking continued. And with every second that passed, Dorian realized that everything he believed about his home, his wife, and his daughter had been a carefully constructed lie. A lie he had helped maintain by choosing not to see. The longer Dorian stood behind that half-open door, the clearer it became that what he was witnessing was not an isolated act, not a moment of excessive strictness, but an entire system built with precision, repetition, and absolute control. Every detail in that room had a purpose. The stool was not random. Its slightly curved surface forced constant micro-adjustments, draining strength faster than a flat surface ever could. The position of Eloan's body was not accidental. It was engineered to exhaust her evenly, arms, core, legs, until nothing in her could remain steady without effort. The black mark on the wall was not decoration. It was a fixed point to trap her focus, to eliminate distraction, to train her mind into submission as much as her body. Even the metronome was part of it. Its rhythm dictated time in a way no child could escape. It removed any sense of uncertainty, replacing it with something worse: predictable, endless endurance. Each second stretched into pressure. Each minute became a test. And somewhere in Maris's hand, the stopwatch translated all of it into numbers, into progress, into something she could measure and refine. Dorian's eyes moved slowly across the room, and what he noticed next tightened something deep in his chest. Against the far wall, neatly stacked, were several identical stools. Not one. Several. Each one worn slightly differently, edges marked, surfaces scratched in patterns that suggested repeated use. This was not a single exercise repeated occasionally. It was a routine with variations, stages, perhaps even levels of difficulty. Beside them lay folded pieces of fabric, thin and light, likely used to wipe sweat, to reset the process, to begin again. Nothing in that room was chaotic. Everything was organized. Everything was deliberate. Eloan's body trembled harder now. The shaking had spread from her legs into her arms, into her shoulders, into her entire frame. The book above her head tilted again, lower this time, her wrists visibly struggling to keep it steady. Her breathing had turned uneven, breaking into shallow bursts that her small chest could barely sustain.
Still, she made no sound.
Dorian realized that silence had been trained into her just as much as the posture. A child who cried would interrupt the system. A child who complained would resist it. But a child who stayed silent could be pushed further, longer, deeper into whatever limit had been set. And Eloan had learned that lesson perfectly. On a low table near Maris, Dorian noticed something else: a black notebook. It was open, pages filled with tight, precise handwriting. Columns of numbers. Notes written in different colors. Small markings that looked like measurements, durations, adjustments. Even from a distance, he could tell this was not casual tracking. It was documentation. Progress. Evaluation. Correction. He did not need to read it to understand what it contained. Every second Eloan stood there was being recorded, analyzed, and turned into data. Her body was no longer just her own. It had become a project. A project under constant observation. Dorian's mind began connecting pieces he had ignored for months. The mornings when Eloan seemed too weak to sit properly. The way she avoided food, not with childish stubbornness, but with quiet fear. The tremor in her hands when she reached for a glass. The unnatural straightness of her posture even when no one was watching. The way she never laughed loudly anymore. The way she always looked at Maris before doing anything, as if waiting for permission that had already been granted somewhere deep inside her conditioning. None of it had been random. All of it had been built here. Inside this room. Under the ticking of that metronome. Eloan's raised leg dropped slightly again, her balance slipping further this time. The stool wobbled under her, the movement sharper, more dangerous. For a fraction of a second, it seemed she might fall completely. Her body reacted instantly. She forced herself back into position with a desperate surge of energy that did not belong to a child. It was not strength, it was fear driving the last reserves of her body beyond what they should allow. Her arms lifted higher again, her fingers tightening around the edges of the book until her knuckles turned pale. Her lips pressed together so tightly they trembled. Dorian saw something in her eyes then. Not just exhaustion. Not just pain. But calculation. She was counting. Not consciously like an adult would, but instinctively. Measuring how much longer she could endure. How much time had passed. How much remained. Her entire focus had narrowed into survival within the rules she had been given. This was no longer a child following instructions. This was a child trapped inside a system she believed she could not escape. Dorian felt a wave of nausea rise through him. He had built empires by trusting systems. By believing that structure created results, that discipline created success, that control eliminated weakness. He had applied those principles to business without hesitation. And now, without realizing it, he had allowed those same ideas to be twisted and applied to his daughter. Maris had taken his trust in structure and turned it into a cage. A cage so carefully constructed that it looked like care from the outside. Dorian's gaze shifted back to her. She had not moved much. Her posture remained composed, her expression unchanged, her attention fixed entirely on Eloan. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no doubt, no internal conflict. She believed in this. That was the most dangerous part. This was not cruelty driven by anger. This was cruelty justified by conviction. Every second Eloan suffered, Maris saw improvement. Every tremor was weakness leaving the body. Every sign of exhaustion was proof that the system was working. To her, this was not harm. This was progress. Dorian understood then that words would not change her. Logic would not reach her. This was not a misunderstanding that could be corrected with explanation. This was something deeper. Something rooted in belief. Eloan's arms dropped a fraction again. This time, slower. Heavier. Her entire body leaned forward as if gravity itself had doubled. The book slipped slightly in her grip, her fingers losing strength one by one. Her supporting leg bent sharply, the stool tilting under her weight. The moment stretched. Fragile. Unstable. Dorian felt it before it happened. The exact point where endurance would turn into collapse. And in that instant, something inside him broke completely. Not with hesitation. Not with doubt. But with certainty. He was no longer observing. He was no longer trying to understand. He was done watching. The system had been revealed. And it was about to be destroyed. Dorian did not think anymore. The moment stretched to its breaking point, and he moved. The door slammed open with a force that shattered the suffocating rhythm of the metronome. The sharp crack echoed through the room like a gunshot, cutting straight through the carefully controlled silence that had ruled this space for months. Everything stopped. Not slowly. Not gradually. Instantly. Eloan's body reacted before her mind could catch up. The sudden shock broke the fragile balance she had been fighting to maintain. Her raised leg dropped, her arms lost control, and the heavy book slipped from her hands. For a fraction of a second, she tried to recover, her body twisting in a desperate attempt to obey the rule she had been trained into. But there was nothing left to hold. Her strength was gone. Her body gave in. She fell. the small, fragile frame hit the wooden floor with a dull, hollow sound that seemed far too loud in the silence that followed. The book crashed beside her head, heavy and unforgiving, a final punctuation to the system that had pushed her beyond her limits. Dorian crossed the distance in seconds. The gift box slipped from his hand and hit the floor somewhere behind him, forgotten before it even landed. He dropped to his knees beside Eloan, his entire world narrowing to the small, trembling figure lying in front of him. She was breathing, but barely. Her chest rose in uneven, shallow movements, her body still shaking even though the exercise had ended. Her eyes were wide open, not with relief, not with safety, but with something far worse. Fear. Dorian reached out instinctively, his hands moving toward her with urgency, with desperation, with everything a father should have been from the beginning. But Eloan recoiled. Not slightly. Not uncertainly. She pulled herself backward across the floor, her small hands pushing against the wood, her body retreating away from him as if he were the threat. Her movements were weak, uncoordinated, but driven by something deeply rooted and absolute.
Terror.
The distance between them widened, inch by inch, until she reached the edge of the room. There, she curled inward, her thin arms wrapping around herself, her body folding into the smallest shape it could manage. Dorian froze. He had expected pain. He had expected tears. He had expected his daughter to reach for him, to collapse into his arms, to seek comfort. Instead, she fled. Her eyes refused to meet his. Her head lowered, shoulders trembling, her entire body shrinking as if trying to disappear from his presence. The fear in her expression was not confusion. It was not surprise. It was recognition. Dorian felt something inside his chest tear open. This was not a reaction to a stranger. This was how she had learned to respond to authority, to failure, to being seen at her weakest. And in her mind, he was not her rescuer. He was part of the system. The realization hit him harder than anything else in that room. Behind him, the metronome still ticked. Tick, tick, tick. The sound now felt unbearable, obscene in its persistence, as if it refused to acknowledge what had just happened. As if the system had not yet accepted that it had been interrupted. Dorian stood abruptly. He turned toward it and crossed the room in 2 steps. His hand came down hard, knocking the device off the table. It hit the floor and broke apart, the ticking stopping mid-beat, leaving behind a silence that felt completely different from before. Not controlled. Not suffocating. Raw. Real. For the first time, the room was no longer ruled by that sound. But the damage it had done remained. Dorian turned back. Eloan had not moved from her corner. Her breathing was still uneven, her body still shaking, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress as if holding on to the only thing that still belonged to her. Every instinct in him screamed to go to her. But something stopped him.
Nothesitation. Understanding.
If he moved too quickly, if he pushed himself into her space the way he had burst into the room, he would only confirm the fear that had already been planted inside her. So he stayed where he was. Still. Silent. Trying to undo, in seconds, something that had been built over months. But he was not the only one in the room. Maris had risen from her chair. Not in panic. Not in guilt. But with controlled irritation, as if something valuable had been disrupted before its completion. Her expression remained composed, her posture straight, her movements measured even now. The calmness in her presence clashed violently with the chaos that had just unfolded. Dorian looked at her, and whatever remained of doubt disappeared completely. There was no misunderstanding here. No accident. No line that had been crossed unintentionally. This had been deliberate. Sustained. Believed. The system had not broken because of a mistake. It had been interrupted. And in Maris's eyes, That interruption was the problem. Dorian stepped forward, placing himself between her and Eloan without hesitation. The movement was instinctive, absolute, leaving no space for negotiation. His body formed a barrier, not just physical but final. Behind him, Eloan remained curled in the corner, small and fragile, still trembling, still silent. In front of him stood the person who had turned his home into a place of quiet suffering. The distance between them was small. But everything had changed. The illusion was gone. The system was exposed. And for the first time since stepping into that house, Dorian was no longer a man trying to understand what was happening. He was a father who had finally seen enough. And there was no going back. The drive to the hospital felt longer than any business trip Dorian had ever taken, even though the distance was short. Time stretched in a strange, distorted way, each second dragging under the weight of what he had just seen.
In the back seat, Eloan lay wrapped in a blanket, her body still trembling in small, uncontrollable waves.
Her head rested against the seat, but she did not relax into it. Even in exhaustion, she remained tense, as if her body no longer knew how to rest. Dorian sat beside her, one hand hovering near her shoulder, not touching, not daring to push past the invisible boundary that had formed between them. That hesitation cut deeper than anything else. A father unsure whether his own child would accept his touch was a reality he had never imagined, and now he was living inside it. The hospital lights were harsh, clinical, unforgiving. The moment they arrived, everything moved quickly. Nurses took Eloan from his arms, placed her on a stretcher, and disappeared behind double doors that closed with a finality that echoed in his chest. The separation was necessary, but it felt like punishment. Dorian was left standing in the corridor. Waiting. The word felt too simple for what it actually was. Waiting was passive. This was something else. This was being forced to sit with every memory, every ignored sign, every moment he had chosen trust over instinct. The image of Eloan standing on that stool replayed again and again in his mind, each time sharper, each time more unbearable. He remembered the mornings. The green juice. The trembling hands. The quiet refusals. The drawing of the house with sealed windows. All the evidence had been there, laid out in front of him, not hidden, not disguised beyond recognition. And yet he had accepted the explanations, because they came wrapped in calm voices and convincing words. Now those explanations meant nothing. Minutes passed. Or maybe hours. Time had lost its structure. When the doctor finally approached, the expression on his face carried a weight that spoke before any report could. It was not panic. It was not urgency. It was something colder. Certainty. The examination had been thorough. Blood tests, physical checks, observation of reflexes, measurements that reduced a child's condition into numbers and indicators that could not lie. The results were simple. There was no disease. No hidden virus. No rare condition. No mysterious weakness. Eloan was not fragile by nature. She had been made fragile. Her body showed clear signs of malnutrition. Her system lacked essential nutrients, her energy reserves were dangerously low, her electrolytes imbalanced to a level that could disrupt normal heart rhythm. The constant fatigue, the dizziness, the cold skin, the weakness, all of it traced back to deprivation. Not illness.
Deprivation.
The green juice, presented as cleansing, had replaced proper meals. The controlled portions had become insufficient intake. The structured routines had turned into physical overexertion without recovery. Her body had been pushed into a state where survival required conserving energy, shutting down anything unnecessary. Growth. Strength. Normal function. All sacrificed. Dorian listened, but the words did not come as a shock. Not anymore. The truth had already revealed itself in that room. What the doctor provided was confirmation, a translation of what he had seen into clinical language that carried no emotion but absolute authority. But the physical diagnosis was only part of it. A specialist joined the conversation. Not to speak about the body, but about the mind. Eloan's behavior during examination had raised concerns that went far beyond physical health. She did not respond like a child seeking comfort. She did not express hunger normally. She showed hesitation, fear, and something more structured, patterns that suggested conditioning rather than instinct. Her reactions were consistent with early psychological trauma linked to control, perfection pressure, and restricted autonomy. She believed something about herself that was not true. She believed she was weak, defective,
undeserving.
And more dangerously, she believed that improvement required suffering. That belief did not come from within. It had been taught, reinforced, repeated until it became part of her identity. Dorian felt the weight of those conclusions settle into something solid and immovable. This was no longer about suspicion, no longer about interpretation. The truth had been fully uncovered, examined, and confirmed from every angle. His daughter had not simply been mistreated. She had been reshaped. Her understanding of the world, of her body, of love itself, had been altered in ways that would not disappear just because the environment changed. Even now, safe inside a hospital, with professionals around her, her mind was still operating under rules that no child should ever carry. Dorian moved toward the observation window. Through the glass he saw her. Small against the white sheets. Wrapped in hospital blankets that looked too large for her frame. A nurse sat beside her, offering something simple, something normal, something any child would reach for without hesitation. Food. Eloan did not take it. She turned her head slightly, her body tightening again, her hands gripping the blanket instead. The refusal was not stubbornness. It was fear. Deep, conditioned fear that had been planted so thoroughly that even hunger could not override it. Dorian's reflection appeared faintly in the glass, superimposed over her fragile figure. For a moment, it looked like he was standing inside the room with her. But he wasn't. He had been outside all along. Outside her suffering. Outside her fear. Outside the reality she had been forced to live every day. That distance, invisible before, now felt impossible to ignore. The realization did not break him. It hardened something inside him. Guilt remained, heavy and undeniable, but it was no longer paralyzing. It transformed into something sharper, something focused, something that demanded action rather than regret. This was not something that could be undone with apologies. It required removal. Separation. A complete break from the source of harm. Dorian stepped back from the glass. The decision formed without hesitation. There would be no return to that house as it was. No continuation. No negotiation. Everything that had allowed this to happen would be cut away. Immediately. Completely. His daughter's recovery would not begin with medicine. It would begin with ending the system that had nearly destroyed her. And he knew exactly where that system began. Dorian did not return to the mansion as a husband. He returned as a man closing a chapter that should have ended long before it began. The house looked the same from the outside, perfect symmetry, trimmed hedges, tall windows reflecting a quiet sky, but the illusion no longer held. What once seemed like order now felt like containment. What once suggested luxury now carried the weight of everything hidden inside. He walked through it one last time with clear eyes. Every room revealed something he had ignored before. The silence that used to feel peaceful now felt unnatural. The carefully arranged furniture felt staged. Even the scent in the air, once comforting, now seemed artificial, like a mask placed over something rotten beneath. Upstairs, The training room remained as he had left it. The broken metronome still lay on the floor. The stool stood in the center, empty now, but still radiating the memory of what it had held. The notebook on the table remained open, its pages filled with numbers and notes that turned a child's life into a measurable experiment. Dorian did not hesitate. He gathered everything. The stools. The stopwatch. The notebook. Every object tied to that system was stripped from the room, removed with a precision that mirrored the system itself, but for a completely different purpose. This was not control. This was erasure. Not denial. Correction. When he found the photograph tucked inside the notebook, something shifted again, not enough to forgive, but enough to understand. A young girl on a stage, dressed beyond her years, holding a prize she had not truly won, her face caught between forced composure and hidden distress. Maris. A child once shaped the same way. A child who had grown into someone who believed that suffering created value, that perfection justified pain, that control was a form of love. Understanding it did not soften the outcome. If anything, it made the decision clearer. Cycles like that did not end on their own. They had to be broken. Dorian left the house with everything that mattered sealed away, not just the objects, but the connection itself. Legal papers followed quickly.
Final, clean, irreversible.
There was no confrontation worth having, no explanation that would change what had already been done. He chose silence where argument would only repeat the same pattern. And then he did something he had never done before. He stepped away from everything that had defined his life. The new house was smaller. Not modest in a way that felt like loss, but different in a way that felt unfamiliar. No marble floors. No echoing halls. No distance between rooms. Sunlight moved freely through wide windows, touching every corner without obstruction. Outside, the yard was uneven, filled with wild grass that had not been forced into perfect lines. Nothing there demanded control. That was the point. Eloan arrived not as a child returning home, but as someone entering unknown territory. Her movements remained careful, measured, as if invisible rules still governed every step. She walked lightly, avoided making noise, watched everything before interacting with it. The system was gone. But its imprint remained. Meals became the first challenge. Food was placed in front of her, warm, simple, normal, but she did not respond the way a child should. She examined it, hesitated, took only the smallest portions, stopped long before her body had enough. Hunger no longer guided her. Fear did. Dorian understood that words would not change this. He could not explain safety into existence. He could not command her to feel differently. The system that had shaped her had not relied on explanation, it had relied on repetition. So he chose a different repetition. One built on contrast. He sat with her. Not across a long table, not as a distant figure of authority, but beside her, within reach. He ate normally. Not carefully. Not precisely. He allowed imperfection to exist in plain sight. Food spilled. Movements were unstructured. Nothing was measured. Nothing was corrected. At first, Eloan only watched. Her eyes followed every motion, searching for the consequence that never came. Each moment stretched with quiet tension, as if she expected the system to return at any second. But it did not. Day after day, the pattern continued. No punishments. No calculations. No conditions. Only consistency. Slowly, something began to shift. It did not happen all at once. There was no single moment of transformation. Instead, it appeared in fragments, small changes that would have gone unnoticed if not for their significance. A slightly larger bite. A longer moment before pulling back. A glance that carried curiosity instead of fear. Dorian did not rush it. He did not celebrate it too early. He understood now that rebuilding required patience equal to the time it took to break. Weeks passed. Then months. The house changed with them. It became louder. Not in volume, but in presence. Movement filled the space. Objects were left where they did not belong. The order of the old mansion was replaced with something far less controlled, far less perfect, and infinitely more real. One afternoon, rain began without warning. The sky darkened, and water fell in heavy drops that soaked the yard within minutes. The sound against the roof was steady, alive, nothing like the mechanical ticking that once controlled every second of Eloan's day. She stood by the window, watching. Not frozen. Not withdrawn. Watching. There was something different in the way she looked at it. Not caution. Not fear. Something closer to interest. Dorian saw it immediately. He moved without hesitation this time. He did not ask for permission. He did not explain the moment. He simply reached out, closing the distance that had once existed between them, and guided her toward the door. Outside, the rain hit cold and sharp. Eloan reacted at first with instinct, her body tensing, her shoulders rising slightly as if preparing for correction. But none came. The rain continued. Uncontrolled. Unmeasured. Free. She stepped forward. One foot into the wet grass. Then the other. The ground softened beneath her weight, mud forming where the water gathered. The sensation was unfamiliar, unpredictable, impossible to control. She hesitated. Then moved again. A step turned into motion. Motion turned into something else. Release. Her feet splashed into a shallow puddle, water spreading outward in uneven patterns. The reaction came without calculation, without permission, without fear of consequence. She laughed. Not quietly. Not carefully. Freely. The sound broke through everything that had been built around her. Dorian stood still, watching. Not interfering. Not directing. For the first time, he was not trying to manage the moment. He was witnessing it. The rain continued to fall, washing over the yard, over the house, over the space that had become something entirely new. The past did not disappear, but it no longer controlled what came next. Eloan moved through the rain without hesitation now, her steps uneven, her movements imperfect, her laughter unstructured. And in that moment, something essential returned. Not fully. Not completely. But enough. Enough to prove that what had been taken could still be rebuilt. Not through control. Not through perfection. But through something far simpler. Freedom.